See this cable? This one's actually one of the rarer types that doesn't really rust. Almost like it must have been made out of stainless or something, but there's probably hundreds of thousands of miles of cable the same size all across the desert. And this stuff is from towed targets. They used to take like a bomber or a cargo plane, and they tow a sleeve, a banner, or like a little airplane, like a glider. It let out a few miles of cable, and then the artillery guns would fire at it. And hopefully at the target, not the plane. Though sometimes, especially the early days of the radar would lock onto the pull plane, the tow plane, and they'd get hit with shrapnel. But they'd cut these things off and drop them all over the region. But especially here, because this isn't too far from a anti-aircraft artillery range. And the banners, they were like cloth, and the sleeves too were cloth with copper mesh inside of them to give off a better radar signal. And they had different devices on the cable so they could cut them, and quick release, and they had other things they pull from time to time, little weird balls that were welded together with like wire mesh, almost like a globe. I have one of those. Hopefully I'll find an artillery shell or something. And here's some old commo wire that the plastic coating is rotted off in the sun. And I'm not even on an army base, and you'll still find this stuff. And I just found a shell fragment in its native habitat. Right in this little arroyo. So this would have been the outside of the shell. This is pretty big. I'd say this is probably from a 90. Just a guess though. I've got plenty of this stuff. I've never found an unexploded high explosive shell out here. And in this area, I found them in a lot of other areas, but I've only found unexploded shrapnel shells. Model 1907. And this wasn't even on a base, and they were still shelling this. They were kicking everybody off their land back in the 40s and 50s. And they were using artillery shells as intimidation. I mean, who wants to live at their house if it could be shelled at any moment, or if your cows get shelled, even though they might pay you for your cows, but it still sucks that all that work you put in and whatnot and your cows got shelled. Might as well just leave and let the government have your land for pennies on the dollar. And eventually the government won, of course. For the most part. They kicked out over 100 families that had made contracts with the government in the 40s, and then the government broke the contract just like they did with the Indians and kicked them off their land. Drove tanks through people's homes when they weren't there, because they'd get people to evacuate so that they could do anti-aircraft fire, and then sometimes they'd come back home. Here's a piece. This would be from the shrapnel shell. This would be the tube that runs down the middle from the fuse down to the powder charge in the base. But they'd come back home and some type of armored vehicle that ran through their ranch house. And they could go petition the army to get it fixed, or they could just sell like the government wanted them to. And that's one reason you'll find shrapnel and parts of rockets all over the place, even on private land. And supposedly Congress stepped in the 50s and stopped them from taking the rest of it. They've got almost the whole valley. And the town I live in is the one last little section that they didn't take. Here's another piece. That's still big enough. You wonder what that's flinging through your lungs. It's a pretty cool shape. I like that one. It's kind of spooky actually when you do come up on an unexploded shell, especially when it still has a fuse on it, just laying there. Feels like it could just explode at any second. There's an Indian artifact. Piece of obsidian. And you can see the point of percussion was right here where my thumb is at. This end, and spread out that way toward my index finger.